Well, I'm glad that Jeff covered as much territory as he did. I wanted to make sure that everyone understood what we mean when we say war resister, and that address that question of the fact that these are volunteer soldiers, but that there are many reasons why people have volunteered, and that it's a strong belief among many people that there is in fact a draft in an economic sense, that people are making these choices for patriotic and economic reasons, because the economy has been so difficult. And in fact, we hear now that they're not having difficulty recruiting, as much difficulty recruiting as they did before, because the economy is so bad, and people are making this really, I think, terrible choice to join the many wars that the United States is involved in, simply because they need to survive. They need some health care. They would like to have a future with an education that they will never be able to afford. They have families that they need to support. So there is a variety of reasons and backgrounds of people. And Larry's going to talk about a different era when the laws were different in Canada with regards to immigration. And so I'm going to talk mostly about law and about some of the individuals that we are dealing with in the War Resister campaign. The campaign started in 2004 with the arrival of Jeremy Hintzman, who you saw in the film, and the recognition that Canadians who wanted people like Jeremy to have a place to live here in Canada needed to do something to make that happen, because it is no longer an option as it was. It was not easy, but it was an option during the era of the American War in Vietnam, that Americans could come to Canada and apply for immigration from inside the country, and that is no longer true. So when you're AWOL from the military and you believe you're being pursued, you can't sit around filing paperwork and waiting to hear whether Canada will let you in. So you come and you make a refugee claim. And so that is why the situation now is different legally than it was for the folks of Larry's generation. And we believe that although the refugee system is not the best way for people to come to our country, and it's unfortunately that it's their only option, it's a very flawed system in many ways. But we believe they have a legitimate claim as political refugees based on the fact that the war in Iraq was not sanctioned by the United Nations, and that soldiers have the right and obligation to refuse illegal orders, among other things. The problem that the war resistors have come up against is that the Immigration and Refugee Board calls itself a board, but in fact only one member decides on the cases of any case. The board refuses to allow discussion of the legality of the war, which is the basis for making a political refugee claim. So that is the first obstacle that the war resistors have encountered, and remains, pretty much the underlying strongest barrier for them in the refugee system. I guess I'll just speak about there's really two approaches that legally the war resistors are taking at the same time. They're making a refugee claim. They're also making applications to stay in Canada on humanitarian and compassionate grounds. And those can be very broad. In the cases of some folks, it's medical. It may be medical reasons. For others, such as right now in the case of Jeremy, he's been in Canada for 7 years. He came with his wife and his son. They now have a daughter who's a Canadian. They are well rooted in our society, with small children who are growing up in our society and entering school and those sorts of things. So that is another reason for a humanitarian and compassionate decision for someone that has come and made a life here. And so in both of those cases, to this point, none of the war resistors has been accepted on those grounds. and appeals have been made, appealing the decisions against the refugee claims and against their humanitarian and compassionate grounds applications. The bill that Jeff was referring to, private member's bill, would have created a much more humanitarian way for war resistors to stay in Canada. The government at any time has the ability to say people who fit a certain criteria can go through another route of immigration, and we've done it in the past. And the criteria were that they would be military people who have been forced to serve in wars not sanctioned by the United Nations, and that they would be subject to all the other rules that immigration puts on people in terms of their previous criminal behavior and all of those sorts of things. So there was some fear-mongering around that said, oh, well, that means we'll just let anybody in. But it wasn't. It was carefully considered and could have been refined had it gone any farther. Would have been a much more humanitarian way for war resistors to come to Canada and not go through this refugee system. One thing that has happened in the last year, there are still legal battles. You saw that basically only 2 people have been sent out of Canada. That is not to say that there are many people who are in a position of jeopardy, who at any time could have a decision against them. Here in Vancouver, in the case of Rodney Watson, he has actually received a deportation order and chose to seek sanctuary in a church, and he's been there since September 2009. And in his case, he has a Canadian wife and a child, and there has been no decision on his case, his application to stay on humanitarian and compassionate grounds. So he felt that all his options were not exhausted before the government tried to force him to leave, and that if he left his wife and child, they wouldn't be able to follow him, he wouldn't be able to support them, and if he were deported, he wouldn't be able to come back, possibly ever, to Canada. So he felt that that was his best option to keep his family together and to insist that the government exhaust all of the possibilities in his case. And to date, there still has been no decision in his application to stay on humanitarian and compassionate grounds. And in the case of Jeremy Hintzman, who was the first person to make a legal attempt to stay in Canada, the courts have ruled against the government, saying that when you've considered people's application to stay on humanitarian and compassionate grounds, you have not considered closely enough people's beliefs, which are protected under international law, including religion, which in Jeremy's case, he had actually attempted to leave the military based on his faith, and that process was extremely messy and bungled and didn't work. But so you have, in addition to these court cases going on and the government's army of lawyers against a few diligent folks who are doing the legal stuff on our side, last summer the Canadian CIC, Immigration and Citizenship Canada. Issued an operational bulletin 202, which gave direction to their immigration officers to single out war resistor cases in the aspect of that they may not be criminally admissible to Canada. And this is part of what happens in immigration cases. They do look at whether people have committed crimes in the past that would make them unsuitable for our country. But this is a very unusual thing to make a blanket statement about a group of people and to issue a bulletin that says basically, send us all your cases, we're going over them with a fine-tooth comb for this group of people. And so these are some of the ways that the government has tried to stop war resistors from coming or to get them to leave, but we're not done yet. These cases are still up in the air. In the case of Rodney, it's been about 18 months now, and while I'm grateful, and I'm sure that Rodney and his family are grateful that the government has honored the tradition of sanctuary and not busted into the church and forced him to leave. They're playing another kind of brutal game by not making a decision in his case and by just ignoring him and leaving him to sit. And in the case of some of these other war resistors, in the legal way that things work, they could quickly make decisions and try to force people to leave, and they haven't been doing that. And so we're a little uncertain about where this all sits, because as the film mentioned, twice Parliament voted on recommendations from the Parliamentary Committee on Citizenship and Immigration. A motion came from that, and that's an all-party committee. Motions came forward basically saying the same kind of thing that the private members bill later on did, that the government has the ability and should work with us to create a provision to allow war resistors to stay. And in our minority government situation, both times those motions passed, not by a huge margin, but significant. So it shows that the will of the Canadian people is backed up by the folks who represent them, by lobbying that we did and engaging in dialogue on this issue. And when this bill, C-440, came in September, there was actually a higher number of folks in the House who voted in favor of it than had voted previously in favor of the other motions. But there was also a higher number of folks that were opposed to it. So there's still strong popular support for the case of war resistors. They still live in a legal limbo. And we're still searching for ways that Canada can show the way that we have been welcoming to people in the past, that we can continue that legacy. And if anyone's ever watching the news anytime, anywhere these days, you know that that is becoming much more difficult. The things that we seem to identify as Canadian are being eroded, and this is one of those things. And in their case, there's people's lives that are hanging in the balance, and people who are living in limbo. And Jeff was making the distinction between folks who stay in the United States and fight and go to jail, and those who come to Canada. And people have said that, well, why didn't they stay and fight? And I believe, as Jeff does, that we all have choices, we all have a role to play, and I think this is something that we can fight this battle on many fronts. And one of them, I think it's important that Canadians are being challenged to support this position. And Jeff mentioned that the folks who have stayed and been incarcerated by the military, have had their lives destroyed. Well, I would argue that the war resistors have made an equally difficult choice, and their lives are, if not destroyed, completely in limbo, have left everything they know, culturally, and their families, and it's a really difficult choice for them as well, and even more difficult to hang on in the face of this constant bombardment of negative decisions, having popular support but not being able to make any headway legally. So that's, I guess, a picture of where we're at today.